announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In the vast, turbulent waters of the Persian Gulf, a potential conflict is brewing, one that could reshape the future of international relations. What if a single missile fired from an unexpected corner of the world triggered one of the most dangerous standoffs in recent history? In this video, we explore a hypothetical yet chilling scenario: an escalation of hostilities between the United States and Venezuela, a confrontation that begins with a bold missile strike on the mighty USS Gerald R. Venezuela, long struggling with internal strife, finds itself in a desperate bid for power on the global stage. With its back against the wall, facing crushing economic sanctions and increasing pressure from the West, the Venezuelan government sees an opportunity for strategic aggression. In the face of mounting international pressure, Venezuela, once thought of as a regional player in South America, now sets its sights on a much larger target: an American aircraft carrier stationed in the Middle East. But what could drive Venezuela to take such a monumental risk? The U.S. Navy's flagship, the USS Gerald R. represents the power and might of the United States military. It's not just a ship, it's a symbol of American strength, a floating fortress designed to project power across the globe. But what if this symbol of dominance became a target in a region far from home? How would the U.S. respond if an Iranian missile, or in this case a Venezuelan missile, was launched with deadly intent? Venezuela's missile, a sophisticated piece of military technology, streaks through the sky with deadly accuracy, aimed directly at the heart of the American fleet. With the missile's speed and precision, it poses a significant threat to the Gerald R. and the countdown to disaster begins. But the Americans are not unprepared. What follows is a complex web of defensive actions, as the U.S. Navy scrambles to intercept the threat. Will the missile hit its target, or will the U.S. military's extensive defense systems succeed in averting disaster? This isn't just a simple exchange of fire. It's a confrontation that could escalate into something far more dangerous. As Venezuela's defensive systems come online, the country mobilizes its forces, not just in the Gulf, but in waters closer to home. Venezuelan fast boats, submarines, and advanced anti-air systems are ready to defend their maritime territory. The U.S., now facing a complex and formidable adversary, has to balance its response carefully, as each move could push the situation closer to a full-scale war. But the real question is this: will this confrontation stay confined to the Gulf, or will it ignite a wider regional conflict? Could this be the spark that leads to an unprecedented clash between two nuclear-armed superpowers, pushing the world to the brink of war? The consequences of such an escalation could be felt across the globe, affecting everything from oil markets to international diplomacy. Stay with us as we break down the events that could unfold in this high-stakes scenario. From the missile strike to the naval maneuvers, from political motives to military strategy, we're going to analyze the steps that could lead to a full-blown crisis. Get ready for a deep dive into one of the most intense hypothetical military confrontations of the modern era. The Persian Gulf has long been a focal point of international tension, serving as both a critical hub for global oil trade and a strategic military battleground for global powers. Its significance is undeniable. Controlling the Gulf means controlling vital sea routes, energy supplies, and influencing regional politics. Over the years, the U.S. has maintained a strong military presence in the area, with multiple aircraft carriers, including the USS Gerald R. regularly deployed to project American power and safeguard its interests. But in the early 2000s, the Gulf saw a shift in power dynamics, as regional actors like Venezuela began to make bold moves that would ripple across the international stage. While historically Venezuela has been far removed from the Middle East's power struggles, a confluence of political, economic, and military developments saw this South American nation take a more assertive stance. Venezuela's relationship with the United States had been deteriorating for years, driven by ideological differences and U.S.-imposed sanctions aimed at weakening the country's socialist government. Economic hardship, hyperinflation, and political instability gripped Venezuela in the 2000s, but the regime of Nicolas Maduro, despite facing widespread opposition, managed to hold on to power. However, Venezuela's growing isolation, coupled with the belief that the U.S. had been attempting to orchestrate regime change, fostered a sense of defiance within the government. For years, Venezuela had positioned itself as an anti-imperialist force in Latin America, opposing U.S. influence in the region and forging alliances with countries like Russia, China, and Iran. This gave Venezuela access to advanced military technology, including sophisticated anti-ship missiles, submarines, and fast attack craft, capabilities that were once considered out of reach for a country beset by economic turmoil. By the early 2000s, Venezuela had managed to expand its military capabilities in secretive ways, with covert military partnerships with Iran and Russia providing the nation with new tools to assert its influence on the world stage. With an increasing number of U.S. warships and aircraft carriers stationed in the Gulf, Venezuela's leadership began to perceive the growing American presence as a direct threat to its sovereignty and regional influence. Caracas, under the influence of military hardliners, came to the conclusion that a bold, provocative act might serve to not only demonstrate Venezuela's strength, but to also push back against U.S. hegemony. This led to a secretive military buildup along Venezuela's maritime borders, with new defense systems, some of them previously unreported, being deployed along the coastline. As tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela continued to rise, there were reports of increased Venezuelan military activity in the Caribbean and the Gulf. Rumors circulated that Venezuela had developed a new, highly advanced variant of the Russian-made P-800 Onyx missile, capable of hitting targets as far as 300 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. The missile was designed to target and destroy high-value naval assets, including aircraft carriers like the USS Gerald R. At the same time, the Venezuelan government invested in clandestine maritime technology, including new fleets of stealthy, fast attack boats and upgraded submarines. These were believed to be positioned not just for defense, but also for potential offensive operations. By 2025, as the U.S. continued to tighten its military grip on the region, Venezuela made the daring decision to flex its newfound military muscle. With tensions at an all-time high, the Venezuelan leadership, influenced by advisors who believed in a show of force as a means of strengthening the country's standing, authorized a missile strike. The USS Gerald R. a symbol of American power, was specifically chosen as the target, not only for its strategic significance, but as a symbol of American imperialism. It was calculated that by striking such a high-profile target, Venezuela could send a clear message to the world. Venezuela was no longer a regional player to be ignored. The launch of the missile took place under a veil of secrecy, with Venezuela deploying a network of fast boats to distract and mislead U.S. forces, creating confusion and providing cover for the missile's trajectory. The missile was launched from a coastal platform, hidden by a combination of dense fog and electronic countermeasures designed to interfere with U.S. surveillance. The Venezuelan government, with its new alliances in Russia and Iran, had anticipated a swift U.S. retaliation, but they also believed that the sheer audacity of the attack would change the power dynamics in the region permanently. With their military ready and international attention firmly focused on the Gulf, Venezuela believed they had taken the first step in reversing the geopolitical balance in their favor. In this tense moment, the stage was set for a clash that no one could have predicted. Venezuela, a country long considered insignificant in global military terms, was now poised to test the strength of the United States in a way that could alter the course of history. What began as a small spark in the heart of the Persian Gulf could quickly ignite into a far-reaching conflict, with consequences far beyond the region. At precisely 11:42 a.m. local time, the unthinkable happened. The USS Gerald R. one of the most formidable weapons in the United States Navy's arsenal, was targeted by a missile fired from a concealed platform along Venezuela's northern coastline. The missile, a modified variant of the P-800 Onyx, a Russian-made supersonic anti-ship missile, shot through the sky at speeds in excess of Mach 2. The U.S. Navy's advanced radar systems picked up the launch almost immediately, but the distance, the speed of the missile, and the sophistication of the Venezuelan countermeasures posed an immediate and serious threat to the aircraft carrier and its crew. The missile's trajectory was precise, aimed directly at the heart of the Gerald R. Ford. With a 450-kilogram warhead designed to destroy large naval vessels, the missile could devastate the carrier, causing catastrophic damage not only to the ship, but also to the U.S.'s military standing in the region. However, this wasn't just an ordinary missile launch. It was the culmination of a well-orchestrated operation designed to send a message to the United States. The Venezuelan government had been preparing for months, working in secret with Russian and Iranian military advisors to perfect this launch. Venezuela's goal was simple: show the world that it could challenge the might of the U.S. military in the most audacious way possible. As soon as the missile launch was detected, the crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford went into action. The first wave of defense came in the form of the ship's advanced radar systems. The Gerald R. Ford is equipped with the Aegis Combat System, one of the most powerful missile defense systems in the world. The radar systems tracked the missile, calculating its speed and trajectory. Within moments, the crew activated their countermeasures, including the ship's Sea Sparrow and ESSM surface-to-air missiles, designed to intercept incoming threats. At the same time, the ship's electronic warfare systems deployed a barrage of jamming signals, attempting to disrupt the missile's guidance systems. But the Venezuelan missile was not an ordinary missile. The P-800 Onyx, which had been modified with the help of Russian engineers, was equipped with advanced electronic countermeasures, designed to resist jamming and stay on course despite the ship's best efforts. The missile also employed a stealthy trajectory, flying just above the waterline to avoid detection by satellite systems. It was a new breed of missile, and the U.S. Navy had never encountered anything quite like it before. As the missile continued its descent toward the aircraft carrier, the crew braced for impact. But the USS Gerald R. Ford was not without its defenses. The Sea Sparrow missiles, fired in rapid succession, locked onto the incoming threat and launched with precision. One of the missiles, however, malfunctioned, either due to the intensity of the jamming signals or the missile's own sophistication, and veered off course. The remaining ESSM missiles had a better chance, but it was clear that time was running out. In a desperate bid to defend itself, the Gerald R. Ford also deployed its close-in weapon systems. The Phalanx CIWS, a rapid-fire machine gun system that can intercept incoming threats at close range. The system locked onto the missile, firing hundreds of rounds per minute in an attempt to destroy the projectile before it could make contact. The barrage of shells whizzed through the air as the missile came closer and closer. But just as the Phalanx reached maximum firing range, a glimmer of hope appeared. A direct hit. The missile detonated mid-air, sending a shockwave through the air as it exploded in a fiery burst of smoke and debris. The U.S. Navy's defense systems had succeeded, but just barely. The Gerald R. Ford had avoided disaster, but only by the skin of its teeth. The crew breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the destruction of their flagship would have had far-reaching consequences. Yet, the missile had proven a crucial point. Venezuela had demonstrated that it could strike at the heart of American military power with deadly force. This attack, though unsuccessful, signaled a new era of global military competition. It was a wake-up call to the U.S. Navy, revealing vulnerabilities in its defense systems and raising questions about how prepared the U.S. was for unconventional threats. The incident would go down in history as a close call, but also as a turning point in military strategy. The Gerald R. Ford had survived, but the shockwaves from the Venezuelan missile strike reverberated across the globe. For the first time in modern history, a small nation had directly challenged the power of the United States military in one of its most heavily guarded regions. The implications of this attack were far-reaching, marking the beginning of a new, unpredictable chapter in international relations. After the failed missile strike on the USS Gerald R. Ford, the situation in the Persian Gulf rapidly escalated. The attack, though unsuccessful in hitting its intended target, set off a chain reaction that forced both Venezuela and the United States to prepare for what was now a full-blown confrontation. While the missile had been intercepted by the ship's advanced defense systems, the very fact that it had been fired sent a powerful message. Venezuela was not going to back down, and the United States was now facing an unpredictable adversary capable of launching such bold strikes. The United States immediately began to mobilize its forces in response to the attack, knowing that a further escalation could result in severe consequences, not only in the Gulf, but for global security. The Gerald R. Ford's crew and U.S. military officials had barely recovered from the missile interception when the next wave of threats began to materialize. Within hours of the missile launch, Venezuela activated its air defense systems and began to deploy a combination of fast attack boats, submarines, and fighter jets to the region. This was not just a defensive move. Venezuela was making it clear that it had the means and the resolve to escalate the conflict. The Venezuelan government's aggressive posturing was calculated to force the United States to reconsider its military actions in the region. By sending these additional forces into the Gulf, Venezuela hoped to send a message of deterrence, making any retaliation from the U.S. more complicated and dangerous. Venezuela's fast attack boats, which had long been a cornerstone of its naval strategy, were now on full display. Equipped with advanced, high-speed engines, these boats could outmaneuver larger naval vessels and pose a significant threat to American ships, particularly those with limited mobility like aircraft carriers. The boats were armed with anti-ship missiles and machine guns, and their primary function was to swarm larger ships, overwhelming them with speed and firepower. The U.S. Navy, aware of the potential threat, quickly repositioned several of its destroyers and frigates in the Gulf to intercept any hostile moves from Venezuela's naval forces. At the same time, the U.S. Air Force increased its reconnaissance flights over the region, monitoring the Venezuelan movements and looking for any signs of an imminent attack. As tensions soared, Venezuela's air defense systems also went on high alert. The country's S-300 anti-aircraft missile batteries, obtained with assistance from Russia, were now ready to engage any American aircraft that ventured into Venezuelan-controlled airspace. These systems, considered to be some of the most advanced in the world, were designed to target and destroy enemy aircraft, including stealth bombers and fighter jets. Venezuela's Air Force, though not as large or technologically advanced as the US's, had received upgrades over the years, particularly from its alliance with Iran and Russia. These included state-of-the-art MiG-29 fighter jets and Su-30 fighter bombers, capable of engaging American forces at long ranges. The situation in the Gulf was rapidly spiraling out of control. The U.S. was well aware that any military engagement with Venezuela had the potential to trigger a broader conflict, potentially pulling in other global powers like Russia, China, and Iran. Despite their military superiority, the United States could not afford to underestimate Venezuela's ability to complicate matters on the ground. The U.S. Navy, already stretched thin with other commitments across the globe, needed to act carefully and strategically. However, despite their overwhelming strength, the U.S. was now in a precarious position. If they responded too aggressively, they risked igniting a larger conflict that would spill far beyond the Persian Gulf. In the midst of this growing military buildup, there were reports of several minor skirmishes between U.S. and Venezuelan naval vessels. The most serious of these occurred when a Venezuelan fast attack boat attempted to board a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Chafee. The Venezuelan boat, swarming in a coordinated fashion with others, came dangerously close to ramming the destroyer, forcing the American ship to fire warning shots. The Venezuelan vessel returned fire, narrowly missing the destroyer, but the message was clear. The Venezuelans were prepared to engage in direct combat. In the tense aftermath, both sides traded blame for the skirmish, but no lives were lost, though the incident left both fleets on high alert. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government was mobilizing its ground forces. With the U.S. Navy on edge in the Gulf, Venezuela had begun moving additional troops and equipment to its western coastline, signaling that it was preparing for a more significant engagement should the need arise. Their goal was to reinforce their territorial integrity and prevent any potential U.S. military actions aimed at weakening their position. On the ground, Venezuelan forces were reinforced with new military hardware, including advanced radar systems and surface-to-air missiles, to bolster their defense infrastructure and secure vital coastal areas. The Venezuelan government made no secret of its intention to defend its maritime sovereignty at all costs. The United States, for its part, was not caught off guard by the mobilization. They knew Venezuela had been preparing for such a situation for months, and they had already begun to adjust their strategy accordingly. The U.S. began increasing its presence in the region, deploying additional fighter jets, surveillance drones, and combat aircraft to assist in reconnaissance and to maintain control of airspace. However, as they began to push deeper into Venezuelan airspace to monitor their growing military capabilities, tensions reached a boiling point. Venezuelan fighter jets intercepted U.S. reconnaissance planes, engaging in high-speed dogfights with American F-35s and F-22s. Although these aerial encounters remained limited to non-lethal skirmishes, they were warning signs that both sides were now on the brink of direct confrontation. With both nations locked in a volatile standoff, the situation seemed increasingly unsustainable. Venezuela, desperate to assert itself as a global player, was prepared to sacrifice everything to demonstrate its resolve. But the United States, with its superior firepower and strategic alliances, wasn't willing to back down either. As both countries continued to move forces into position, the risk of a broader conflict became more apparent. The U.S., backed by its allies in Europe and the Middle East, was primed for retaliation. But would it be enough to stop Venezuela's ambition from spiraling into full-blown warfare? As the standoff continued, world leaders nervously watched the developments unfold, realizing that what began as an isolated missile strike could very well end up being the spark for a much larger and more destructive conflict. Both sides seemed locked in a game of brinkmanship, each calculating their next moves with the weight of global security hanging in the balance. What was clear, however, was that this was no longer just a battle between two nations. This was a global showdown, with implications that would resonate across borders, economies, and the very fabric of international diplomacy. The question was no longer whether the conflict would escalate, but when, and who would be the first to make the decisive move. The events in the Persian Gulf had reached a critical point, and what began as a missile strike on the USS Gerald R had now escalated into a potential global crisis. The confrontation between the United States and Venezuela had drawn in not just military forces, but also the attention of world leaders, who understood that the fallout from this conflict could change the course of history. As both sides continued their show of force, the real question was not whether the situation would spiral out of control, but how it would unfold, and whether the world could avoid full-scale war. The consequences of the conflict were already becoming apparent. The U.S. military had been forced to divert resources from other regions to bolster its presence in the Gulf, significantly increasing the strain on its already stretched forces. The rapid mobilization of U.S. troops, naval vessels, and aircraft had a profound effect on the global balance of power, sending ripples through financial markets, global trade, and diplomatic relations. Oil prices surged as the prospect of war in one of the world's most critical oil-producing regions seemed imminent. Venezuela, seeing its move as a way to assert its dominance in the region, found itself increasingly isolated from the international community. While it had some support from its allies, including Russia and Iran, the international community was hesitant to align itself with a nation so openly challenging the U.S. Countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East watched closely, calculating how their interests could be affected if the conflict expanded beyond the Gulf. As the situation in the Gulf became more volatile, the risk of broader military engagement seemed ever more likely. The U.S., while maintaining a hardline stance, had also initiated behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts, reaching out to key allies in an attempt to broker a ceasefire or a peaceful resolution. However, Venezuela, emboldened by its successful missile strike and the absence of immediate U.S. retaliation, remained defiant. It had already shown the world that it could stand up to the might of the U.S. military, and the country's leadership had no intention of backing down. Venezuela's government made it clear that any further U.S. aggression would be met with force, and they would continue to defend their territorial waters at all costs. But even as Venezuela braced for potential retaliation, They knew that a wider conflict with the United States would be disastrous for the country's already fragile economy. In the U.S., the consequences of the conflict were also being felt. President Walker, under intense pressure from both the military and the public, knew that an open war with Venezuela could risk a far greater escalation, potentially involving other world powers like Russia and China, both of whom had significant economic and military interests in the region. The U.S. government found itself caught between the desire to assert its military power and the need to avoid the political and economic fallout that would come with a larger-scale conflict. President Walker's administration was keenly aware that such a war could shift the global power dynamics, opening up opportunities for adversaries like Russia and China to take advantage of the situation. The potential for full-scale war loomed, and with it came the very real possibility of a direct confrontation between nuclear-armed nations. While the US and Venezuela were not nuclear powers themselves, both Russia and China, key allies of Venezuela, held significant nuclear arsenals, making any military escalation a risk for global security. The fear of a nuclear conflict, even if indirectly sparked, was palpable across the world. Diplomats, international organizations, and intelligence agencies worked around the clock to assess the situation and explore diplomatic channels that could de-escalate the crisis. In the aftermath of the initial missile strike, the world watched anxiously, waiting to see if any diplomatic efforts could prevent a total breakdown. In the Gulf, both sides were on edge, with military forces in a constant state of readiness. The question that lingered in the air was whether the tensions could be eased before the situation spiraled completely out of control. For now, both sides had their fingers on the trigger, and the world was holding its breath, hoping for a resolution before this narrow confrontation turned into a global conflict. The outcome of this crisis would have lasting ramifications, not just for Venezuela and the United States, but for the entire world.